Hello, my name's Shaw Coleman. I'm the minister of the Baptist Church of Garter Lane, and this is the final of the sequence of Bible studies that we've been doing looking at Paul's letter to his friends in the church at Philippi. We've looked at various themes rather than doing a chapter by chapter study, and today in some ways we're getting to the most important point, because it's very clear that for Paul, people are more important than principle. He recognises that dogma, whilst it has its value, must not get in the way of people. And so in this, our final studies, I want to look at some of the people he actually mentions. Interestingly, throughout this, he talks about, the Greek word is adelphoi, but most translations translate that not just as brothers, but brothers and sisters. And because women are mentioned in this letter, it's quite appropriate that it should be sent to brothers and sisters. He's not lecturing principles to people. His job, he believes, is to be Christ-like as he encourages others to be Christ-like. And that's a person-centred approach. It is so easy to lose sight of people, too busy finding out what they do or don't do for a living. We look for the labels which come from their work, or their family relationships, or their health condition, or indeed their football team. You will know that I have spent many years working with people who, well, they've had various names at Monyhull Hospital. Indeed, that's had its name changed. If you look at copies of the Birmingham A to Z, you see it referred to as Monyhull Colony. At Monyhull, over the years, people were classified. They were given labels like moron or imbecile. They weren't negative terms at all. They were simply a measure of intelligence quotient. But other phrases have been used as well, retarded or the mentally handicapped. When I started working there, we referred to those who lived there simply as residents, which was a much nicer way of talking about people. But there have been other ways of describing them as lunatics, because they were influenced by the phases of the moon, and that was shortened to loonies. Because I worked in a school that was alongside Monyhull, an unkind phrase there that pupils used to describe one another for doing a stupid thing was to describe them as a money. But things are a lot better now, and we refer to people with a learning disability, or sometimes not quite as satisfactorily as service users or clients. And increasingly we're talking about patients again. For me, and for the chaplaincy team at Monyhull St Francis Church, we prefer to use the word friends, and if it needs any more, we say friends who happen to have a learning disability. Seeing people rather than their label, their condition. And that's what Paul is doing in this letter to the Philippians. Over the next few moments, I want to pick on some of the individuals he refers to, and maybe draw out some of the significance of them to help us see why people really do matter in Paul's mind. So, Paul refers to several people. He refers to Timothy. He refers to somebody called Epaphroditus. He refers to Euodia and Syntyche. He refers to Clement. And he refers to somebody who he describes as my faithful partner, which is clearly somebody else. And of course, in the collective, he uses the word adelphoi, the Greek for brothers, and it's usually, as I've said, translated as brothers and sisters. Let's have a look at some of those that I can deal with more quickly, and then we'll concentrate on the rest. Firstly, Clement. Clement, we've no idea who he is at all. There's no reference to him, really. He's an anonymous Christian, although he does have a name, if that's not a contradiction in terms. But he is a key part of the team. And Christianity, so often, is not about seeing the people, but finding the love. And that's what he seems to have done. The second person that we don't know very much about, is not even referred to by name, It's my faithful partner. This is somebody who's based in Philippi, and working backwards, when Paul was in Philippi, he was there with Silas and Luke. Now, Paul and Silas left, but Luke stayed on. Whether or not he put his gospel together there, we can't be sure. But remember, Luke did write for a Gentile audience, and Philippi was definitely not part of the Jewish world. So he worked with Paul in Philippi, and in staying on, probably became a senior statesman there. So Clement and my faithful partner, mentioned in the same verse in chapter 2 of the letter. Let's turn to 4 more people. Firstly, we'll have a look at Timothy, and then we'll go on to Epaphroditus, and the rather curious story of 2 quarrelling people, Euodia and Syntyche.
Let's turn then to Timothy. Timothy was Paul's really very good friend. They worked together extensively. They met on Paul's second missionary journey, and thereafter Timothy was used by Paul as his representative, and obviously at times when he was in prison he needed someone to go and speak on his behalf. You'll find Timothy referred to in several of the letters to the Thessalonian church, both the first and second letter to the Colossians, he mentioned in the letter to the Romans, and he's also of course mentioned in the letter to the Philippians. And Timothy is seen, and if you go through the various New Testament references to him, as somebody who was trusted because he was prepared to take the message. In fact, one of the commentators said this about him: others might be consumed with selfish ambition, but Timothy's one desire was to serve Paul and Jesus Christ. In the end, Timothy too was a prisoner for Christ's sake. Timothy is the patron saint of all those who are quite content with the second place, so long as they can serve. So, Timothy, people matter. And Paul had in Timothy somebody who actually shared the imprisonment, was to himself suffer a martyr's death, but was there. And I love that little bit about he was willing to understand that he had a role to play, but he wasn't centre stage. Extraordinary example of a life of service.
Turning now to Epaphroditus, he was a very interesting character. He was from Philippi, and he was sent by the Philippi church to provide gifts for Paul when he was struggling, and particularly because he was in house arrest in prison, he needed as much encouragement as he could get. And, well, having been sent, he was sent in difficult circumstances because Rome was notorious for something called the Roman fever, which swept the city like a scourge. In fact, we do know that he was very ill when he was there, and Paul was extremely concerned for him, and he knew that word might have got back to Philippi of how ill Epaphroditus was. So he was able to reassure them that Epaphroditus was well. Now, if Epaphroditus had been sent to stay with Paul, I think, was very concerned that with his health, he needed to go home, but he wanted to reassure the Philippians that Epaphroditus was no quitter. He hadn't given up. Barclay's commentary on this, he makes the comment that there's a word in the passage which has a later famous usage. It's in the King James Version, which speaks of Epaphroditus not regarding his life. There is bystander version says not risking his life. But the word is actually paraboleuste. It's a gambler's word, and it means to stake everything on the turn of a dice. Paul is saying that for the sake of Jesus, Epaphroditus gambled his life. Now, the later usage is interesting because it throws lines backwards for us. Because in the early church, there was an association of Christian men and women who were called the parabolani, the gamblers, who visited the prisoners and the sick, especially those who were ill with dangerous and infectious diseases. When everybody else threw out the dead and fled in terror, these groups of people buried the dead and nursed the sick in plague-stricken cities, and often saved those places at the risk of their own lives. And the point that Paul is trying to get across to the Philippians is that the man who's coming back to them is coming back as a brother, as a sharer in the work, as a frontline soldier, that somebody with, as Barclay calls it, an almost reckless courage, which makes him ready to gamble with his life to serve Christ and men. It's a horrible image in some ways, because we don't like to think about it. But maybe there's a challenge for us who actually prefer to stay so safe we don't go anywhere. It's a bit like that story about the ship. A ship is safest in the harbour. But that's not what ships were built for.
And so we come to the final two people, in fact, that we want to look at. And let me read you the relevant bit from chapter 4. Paul says this: I plead with Euodia and I plead with Syntyche to be of the same mind in the Lord. Yes, and I ask you, my true companion, we think that was Luke, help these women, since they have contended at my side in the cause of the gospel, along with Clement and the rest of my co-workers, whose names are in the book of life. Frustratingly, that's it, they don't tell us anymore. We don't know what the argument is. In fact, if it was doctrinal, then it's highly likely that Paul would have told the one who was wrong what was wrong. But in fact, it looks like they've just had a disagreement. And reading the commentators on this, it's actually very interesting, I think, to look at, not that it was two women arguing, but how ridiculous it is when people get caught up with stuff that doesn't really matter. Those energies for work which matters were being diverted into something that was personal and unhelpful. And he went on to say, this commentator, of course we have different opinions, but the emphasis that Paul has been putting through this letter is to be like-minded. 4 times he says to be like-minded. And you get the impression that there was an issue in the Philippi church that was going on that was probably not doctrinal, but nevertheless was damaging the work of the fellowship. It was losing sight of Christ because of some petty bickering, maybe. And in saying that they need to solve the problem, he says that they should have the mindset of Christ. Do you remember that came in Philippians chapter 2? To have the mindset of Christ. And I suppose the modern way of putting that is to ask the simple question, well, what would Jesus do? And he's saying to Luke and Clement and 1 or 2 others, look, have a word with these two. Sort it out. We don't need to have any hassle over this whatsoever. And there you have it. Paul is talking about the fact that people matter. And in talking about Timothy and Clement and Luke and Euodia and Syntyche, and perhaps the most significant in a quiet way, Epaphroditus, he was saying that the people are the people who make it work. Dogma may help. Principles are important, but don't let them ever lose sight of me. As we come to an end to this series on Philippians, can I finish with what Paul said to the Philippian church towards the end of his letter? He says this: finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, think about such things. Whatever you have learned or received from me, put into practice. And the God of peace be with you all. Thank you for being part of it. The God of peace be with you as well. Until next time, God bless you. Bye-bye.